Hi everyone, good afternoon. This is the ECON315 guided study group session, and today I'm going over the extra practice problems from lesson 10. There's only 3 problems for this week, so this session should really not be longer than a half hour, but I can stay after since there's probably going to be extra time if anyone has questions. So I'll get started right away. The first one is about estimating gender wage gap. So it says one measure of wage discrimination, say between men and women, is the portion of the gender wage gap that is explained by differences in the payoffs to productive characteristics. After analyzing wage data using regression analysis, he obtained the following expressions for male and female wages. So we see those 2 equations they give us, and then it says where W is the hourly wage, education is years of education, experience, EXP is total years of experience, and tenure is years worked with one's current employer. Furthermore, the average female wage, WF, is $10 an hour. The average male wage, WM, is $18 an hour. The average education for males is 15 years. The average experience for males is 20 years, and the average tenure for males is 6 years. So a lot of information from the start. So number 1 says, what is the gender wage gap between males and females? So looking at all this information, the gender wage gap would just be the difference in pay between the male wage and the female wage. So they already gave us that in the given information from the averages. So we can see that the male wage is $18 an hour and the average female wage is $10 an hour. So the difference between 18 and 10 is 8. So $8 is going to be the gender wage gap, which is our answer. Number 2 says, what is the hypothetical wage of a female with characteristics the same as the average male? So I'm going to switch over to my whiteboard to show this problem. So they wanted to know the female wage. So we know that our equation is WF equals 2 plus 0.2 education plus 0.2 experience plus 0.5 tenure. And they wanted to know what the wage would be if they had the characteristics as the average male. So they gave us this as 15 for education, 20 for experience, and then 6 for tenure. So I'm just going to plug that into there to get WF equals 2 plus 0.2 times 15 plus 0.2 times 20 plus 0.5 times 6. And then solving for this, we can see that it becomes 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 3 again. So we can see that the female wage would be 5 plus 4 is 9, and plus 3 is $12. And that is our answer. So this is what the female wage is if they had characteristics as the same characteristics as the average male. So number 3 says, what fraction of the gender wage gap is explained by differences in the productivity characteristics of men and women? And what fraction of the gender wage gap is explained by differences in the payoffs to productive characteristics? So to explain this one, it's a little challenging, but I'm going to start with the second half of the question first. What fraction of the gender wage gap is explained by differences in the payoffs to productive characteristics? So the two equations they gave us at the very beginning, I've written down the female one. The male one they also included in the problem. Those are equations showing the payoffs to productive characteristics. Like it shows the differences between males and females of those payoffs. So what we can see is when the productivity characteristics are held constant, what the only difference we're looking at then is the differences in the payoffs from these equations. So if the male wage was $18 with these characteristics that I just did in the previous problem for females. If for the males with those characteristics it was $18, and for the females we can now see it's $12, we can see that there's a wage gap of $6 now. The new wage gap is $6. So with the productivity characteristics held constant and only looking at the differences in the payoffs to productivity, which is shown in the form of these equations, we can see that the difference is $6 of the total $8 wage gap that we figured out in number 1. So the $6 difference from the difference in payoffs to productivity characteristics over the $8 is going to be the fraction of that wage gap explained by the payoffs. So I'll write it down. So this is for the first, number 1, part 3. So the differences in payoffs to productive characteristics. Hopefully you're able to follow along. This one's a confusing one. So differences in the payoffs to productive characteristics. We can see that this difference is $6 because for the males, their wages were $18. For the females, when the productivity characteristics are held constant for both groups, the female wage is $12. So that difference of $6 shows the difference, shows the portion of the wage gap explained by differences in the payoffs to productive characteristics. So our original wage gap was $8, and now we just found out how $6 of it is explained. So $6 over $8 shows us that 75% of the wage is explained by this. So then we can see that the other $2 of the wage gap or 25% is then explained by differences in productivity characteristics. Again, I apologize for explaining that a little weirdly. It is challenging, but this will be recorded so you can go back and replay it to get that explanation. But the big part is recognizing that the productivity characteristics are held constant. So then we can, from the 15, the 20, and the 6, those are held constant for both groups. So that allows us to just look at the differences in the payoffs from these equations. And we see that difference is $6, which explains 75% of the wage gap. That was found in part 1. And then the other $2 explains the other part of the wage gap, and that's explained by just productivity characteristics between males and females. But that is all I have for number 1, so I'm going to move on to number 2. So, tastes for a discrimination model. Assume the marginal revenue product for minority workers is given by MRP equals 40 minus 5N, where N is the number of minority workers. The market wage for minorities is $5 an hour. Discriminating firms devalue the contributions of minorities at a rate of $5 an hour, so D equals 5. Number 1, how many minority workers do non-discriminating firms hire, and what is their economic profit level? So this problem has 2 different parts, and then 2 questions to go with it. So the first part, how many minority workers do non-discriminating firms hire? This is just asking us to find the value of N in our equation that they gave us. So going back to my whiteboard, they told us that the marginal revenue product is determined by 40 minus 5NM, and then the wage is $5 an hour. So the last part of the given information about what discriminating firms do, we don't have to pay attention to that part yet, because in number 1, it's just asking about non-discriminating firms. So when it's asking for how many workers non-discriminating firms hire, all we have to do is set these 2 equal to each other, and that's because for profit maximization and determining how many workers to hire, we've learned already that marginal benefit has to equal marginal cost. In this case, the marginal cost is the wage, and the marginal benefit is the MRP. So by plugging in the 5 for MRP, we get a system of equations that we can then solve for N, which they told us was the number of minority workers. So then solving this out will give us the amount of minority workers non-discriminating firms need to hire. So looking at this equation I just wrote down, we can subtract 5 from each side to get 35 on the right, and then add 5N to the left. And then dividing each side by 5, we get N equals 7. So we know that non-discriminating firms need to hire 7 workers. Or at least that's how many they should hire. And then it asks what their economic profit level is. So this can be best solved by graphing it, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to draw out this graph really quick. So the y-axis will be wage, and the x-axis will be labor, what we've been doing all semester. So also understand that in this problem, this is wage or MRP. MRP. I don't know why I added the E. So we just have to graph each of these 2 things. So in graphing MRP equals 40 minus 5N, how we can do that is 40 is going to be our intercept when N, and that's found by plugging in 0 for N. And then the L-intercept is going to be 8, and that's found by plugging in 0 for MRP. So then after finding those 2 intercepts, we can just draw a line connecting them. And we know it's downward sloping because there's a negative sign in front of the 5. And then graphing the other one of wage equaling $5 an hour, that's the same as saying, if this were an XY plane, this could be transformed into y equals 5. So if this were an XY plane, what we would do is just draw a horizontal line at y equals 5. In this case, it's going to be w equals 5. So we can do that. And then label it as wage. I'm going to label this line as MRP. So then this point where the two lines intersect is what we just solved. L equals, well, in this case, N or L, according to the graph, is 7. There. So everything labeled. So another thing we can see on this graph is this rectangular portion that I'm shading in is the total wage bill, which is the amount of workers times how much their wage is. So it's how much, it's like the total cost of that the company is paying in wages. But then we can see that our profit is going to be this triangle area. And that's because that's the value of output these workers are producing that doesn't contribute to the cost. So it can be brought in as profit. So then specifically finding that profit, we just have to solve for the area of a triangle. So 1/2 base times height. So the base would be 7 and the height would be 40 minus 5. So we can see that becomes 1/2 times 7 times 35, and then 1/2 times 245. So we get a profit of $122.50. Like I said, the easiest way to find a profit level is just to graph it. And so graphing it correctly and then finding the area of that triangle. So then they ask the same exact thing for number 2, but now with discriminating firms. So how many minority workers do discriminating firms hire? So the difference that we need to factor in now is what they said earlier about discriminating firms devalue the contributions of minorities at a rate of $5 an hour. So what happens with this is that we have the MRP equation of MRP equals 40 minus 5N. So we know that the MRP is the value of that additional output. So if discriminating firms are devaluing these contributions on minorities, so if they're devaluing their additional output at a rate of $5 an hour, what we can do is just add on a minus 5 this equation to see that this value is actually going down by $5. And then we can just use this new MRP equation the same exact way if the market wage is still $5. And we can then set those two equal to each other to find the amount of workers this discriminating firm would hire. So 5 equals 40 minus 5N minus 5. So this comes out to be 5 equals 35 minus 5N. 5N can be added to the left, and then 5 can be subtracted on the right to become 5N equals 30. And dividing each side by 30, we get an N of 6. So when the non-discriminating firm hired 7 workers, this discriminating firm is going to hire 6 workers because of how they devalue their output or devalue their contributions. So then we can solve for the profit level the same exact way. So this is going to be wage or MRP, and this is labor. So then solving for these intercepts, we see that when n is 0, our MRP, well, in this case, the x-axis I should put is n instead of L, but I've been using, L has been what's used the whole semester, so I wanted to keep it consistent, but just know that n and L in this problem are the same thing. I'm not like switching anything up on you. So when n is 0, MRP is going to be 35. And then when MRP is 0, L or N is going to be 7. Now once again, we can just draw a line to connect the two. And the wage is still constant at $5, so we can draw that line the same exact way we did last time. So that's going to be wage. This one's going to be MRP. And then once again, we can see that these two intersect at L or N equals 6 that we just solved for. And then finding the profit level is going to be the same area we found last time. So it's going to be this shaded area above the wage line. So again, the area of a triangle is 1/2 the base times height. So the base is going to be 6 because we see that right here. And the height is 35 minus 5, which is 30. And then solving this out, we see that it becomes 1/2 times 180, and then we know that half of 180 is 90. So the profit level for the discriminating firm is $90. And that is all that was needed for question 2. I think the hardest part with that problem was just figuring out that the best way to find the profit level was to graph it, and then understanding how to factor in this discriminating firm's devaluation into the second equation for the second part of the problem. So that'd be something good to focus on and know how to do. But that's all of number 2, so there's just one problem left. So moving back to number 3. Wage gaps. So suppose that the hourly marginal revenue product of all workers in a particular labor market is MRPL equals 20 minus L, where L represents the number of workers hired. The hourly wage rate for women in this market is $5. What is the wage gap if 12 workers are hired? Is this gap a reliable measure of discrimination against women in the workplace? So they gave us a little bit of information that we have to solve for. So MRPL equals 20 minus L, where L is the number of workers hired, and they said that the wage is $5 an hour. So what is the wage gap if 12 are hired? So we first need to know what the wage is if 12 are hired. So as I said in the last problem, we can see that MRPL equals wage. In these problems, So if we want to find out the wage for 12 or higher, we just need to sub in 12 for L. So the wage will be 20 minus 12, which equals $8. So if 12 workers are hired, and this model shows us that they should be paid $8, but then they're actually being paid $5, we can see that the wage gap is going to be 8 minus 5, which is 3. So there's a wage gap of $3, and then it asks if this gap is a reliable measure of discrimination against women in the workforce. And this is more of a conceptual question that they give you the answer to on Canvas, but it says that this isn't a reliable measure because even though there is a gap, we do not know the causes of discrimination and we cannot imply that it exists. So pretty straightforward answer, but that was all of number 3, really short, but that's all the problems I have for you today, and that's it for this week. So hopefully you're able to follow along, and good luck with your studying.